right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about designing for the command line. So first, I just thought I'd start off with talking about just what is it exactly that a command line interface is. So anytime you're interacting with your computer, you're really just kind of telling it to do something. And a command line tool is how you tell it to do something using text instead of clicking a button. I think it's really helpful to remember that this is what computers used to be. They were really only text interfaces. They were just terminals. And this is what computers were like when Unix was being created. And Unix is the operating system that's the basis for a lot of the basic concepts that we take for granted today. And one of those concepts is the nested file system. So I'm sure we're all familiar with this, but relatively quickly from those text interfaces, we moved to using these kinds of graphic interfaces, or what we call GUIs. But that original text interface, the command line, still exists and is used today. So this is the text version of what it is you just saw. So this means change directory or folder into the GitHub CLI folder and then list the contents of that folder. So really, all CLIs are is a way to interact with your computer and the files on them. So Unix comes with all of these out-of-the-box commands. You just saw cd and ls. And while these commands are all really powerful and foundational, they can be really hard to understand. There's not a consistency to how they're named, and it's not very obvious what they are or what they do or how you might use them. So just to give you a sense of what these commands look like. So if you write cat with a file name, like what would you maybe expect this to do? It actually, at its most basic, just outputs the contents of that file. Cat stands for concatenate. grep is how you search for strings within a file, and grep actually stands for global regular expression print. So these are just terms that you kind of have to just learn. So that would just output that line that matched that string I passed it. And rm means remove or delete. So this is how I would delete this file. And that actually just outputs nothing, which is pretty worrying, right? Because Unix follows this principle called no news is good news. So basically, if everything goes fine, just say nothing. So a lot of that design was intended to limit the amount of characters that were being used, because screens at the time were small and keyboards could be uncomfortable to type on. So, some of these commands are actually so obscure that they were literally just inside jokes from Berkeley or Bell Labs back in the 70s. I think this one might be a little bit of an urban legend, but you can see that this command biff was actually just named after someone's dog who used to bark at the mailman. So I don't think that this command is used very frequently anymore, but I think this really illustrates how these things were happening. And I think it's also important to note that I don't think these commands were being designed with like this kind of longevity in mind. They didn't realize how popular or how long-standing these commands would end up being. So these problems actually existed already back in the early 80s as Unix was becoming more popular. So this is a article that Don Norman, the author of Everyday Things, wrote before he even published his book. And he criticizes a lot of these things that I've been talking about. And at large, like, these things really still exist today, because we really did move on to graphic interfaces, and the terminal kind of got left behind. And that brings me to Git. In addition to these out-of-the-box Unix commands, people make additional command line tools. So you could think of them kind of like apps for your terminal. And so Git is a version control tool, and that is what GitHub is powered on. So as a command line tool, you can see that Git is an improvement on these out-of-the-box commands, and that it uses whole words. But this is still kind of confusing. So what do these words mean? What does rebase mean? What does commit mean? And these are concepts that you have to learn outside of just memorizing these commands to use in a certain order. So this is actually a quote from a parody interview. So this is not a real quote, just to be very clear. But this is a quote from a parody interview with Linus Torvalds, who's the creator of Git. I saw this quote floating around the internet a lot, and it took a lot of work for me to figure out that this was not a real quote, which I think says something about how it resonates. But I'm just using this to say that a lot of people really struggle with these concepts, and they really always assume it's their fault, or like they're not a real developer because these things are hard to learn. But it's not. It's really just that these things really weren't designed to be simple to pick up. But so all of this said, people do use command line tools for a reason, and they've persisted in their current form for a reason. I think this really boils down to the fact that it's really the ultimate power tool. It's interacting with your computer without any guardrails, and you can do whatever you want with that. So things that people love being able to automate really tedious tasks. They can move really fast because of that. It's very flexible. You can compose these different commands together, string them together to do what you want. And I think people also really value the experience of using the terminal. So they build up a muscle memory to go really fast. They don't have to take their hands off the keyboards, and you always have a history of actions above you. And I think a little bit you get to feel like a hacker in a 90s movie. But something I like to think about a lot is just how much people really like to learn in general, but I think especially on GitHub, because they come to GitHub to code and to collaborate with other developers, and these are really important skills to have. So if we assume that this is what a learning curve looks like for these things today, I really think that we can make these things easier to learn without necessarily oversimplifying them. So people are more than capable of learning hard things, and they should, but there's so much we can do to make these things less obscure and less arcane. So you could argue that that's all fine because people who are novices prefer graphic interfaces anyway, and people who are advanced developers just will pick up command line tools with no problem. But I think maybe this is true in a really large strokes, but I don't think it's more accurate to say that people really do just feel safe and trust whatever it is they were taught first. So I've talked to a lot of advanced developers who prefer using graphic tools because they're like, why would I not just click on a button if I can click on a button? And I talked to a lot of beginner to intermediate folks who prefer command line tools because that's what they were taught and that's what they're comfortable with now. And of course, it's always important to remember that everyone is a beginner at some point. So that brings me to making GH, GitHub CLI. GH is a tool that sits alongside Git. And fun fact, it did actually come out of beta this morning. So that's exciting. But when I talk to a lot of people about my work, I get questions like, what is it exactly that you're designing? Like, what do you do day to day? So just to make that super clear up front, what I design is the commands we should make. So together with my team, we thought that it would be really valuable for people to be able to list their issues from the command line. So we decided that that command would be named gh_issue_list with the filter state closed. We decided what that would output. So it would show the list with things in red with the columns. And we also decide how people discover them. So how can we help people know to open up a blank terminal and know how to type gh_issue_list? So taking a step back, just our overall goals with the project, we wanted to bring GitHub concepts to the terminal. So there's a lot of concepts within GitHub that don't exist in Git. And we wanted to enable people to be able to script and automate with those things. And we also really wanted to reduce context switching between the terminal and the website, the GitHub website. So this is a quick overview of just what it can look like day to day for a developer to move between github.com and the terminal. So this might not seem like that big of a deal, but I really think it's similar to the phenomenon of when you walk through a door and you like totally forgot why you went in that room in the first place. And so that friction really adds up over time. And we saw just a great opportunity to bring all of these things together. So while we might not build every single thing that exists on GitHub, we saw a lot of value in letting you do your core things from where you already are. So like I mentioned earlier, these are the things that people love. And so these are the things we want to emphasize in anything we design. And these are the things that we can't get in the way of when we're designing as well. And these are the things that we want to mitigate. So there's a total lack of affordances. Command line tools can be really unforgiving of mistakes, even for advanced developers. Like you hit the command and it just deletes something and there's no way to undo that. So it's kind of scary sometimes to work with it. It relies on memory a lot. There's all these commands that you have to like keep in your head all the time and memorize, and different command line tools do it in different ways. And overall, it just really makes you think a lot. So I think this feeling is really encapsulated by this, like you open up a blank terminal and you just have this cursor just kind of mocking you. So when you're designing anything visually, these are really the variables you have at your disposal. You And we really do have most of these things when we're designing for the command line. We still have color, we still have space. We don't have type size because all of the type is the same size, but we can format things and make them bold. We can add icons through Unicode. We definitely don't have images, but we do have language, which I think is our most important tool. So early on when I was designing, I really wanted to just get a sense of what was possible. So I spent some time looking for just the absolute wackiest command line tools I could possibly find. And this one is my favorite. So this is actually a globe that someone made in the terminal. And this just totally blew away like any sense of what I thought was possible. And I think it's really cool to see that despite the fact that there's no images in the command line, this person was able to create a map of the entire world. I also spent some time looking for games that people make on the command line. So this is a typing test that someone made. And I just really loved this as an example of a really clear and simple interface that's still fun. So this was another great example to help me just understand what constraints I was working with. So after gathering all that inspiration, I worked together with my team to generate as many possibilities as we could and go as wide as we wanted. And we actually did that in Google Docs. So it turns out if you make the background black and use a monospace font, Google Docs really feels like a terminal. So this was a great opportunity for us to figure out together what we wanted to do and what we didn't want to do, and how interactive we wanted to get, and how we wanted to talk to our users. And you can see in our comments here, it was a really great way for us to discuss right in line what it was that we liked, what we didn't. And this is really how we nailed down what we thought the interaction of this tool should be. So this is actually still what I use today. I have this template that has kind of like our loose design system in it, and this is my jumping off point for any tool. And we still use this today. I really hope that we can actually open source this so that our open source contributors can use this to share their ideas with us. So these are just some higher fidelity designs that I've done recently. So to give you a sense of what we made, so what life is like with GH and without GH. So right now, when you're checking out someone else's pull request or when you're reviewing their code, basically, you have to use these few different Git commands, and no one can ever remember them. I've talked to a lot of people who complain that they always need to Google it every time they need to do it, and now we have that as just one simple command. To clone someone else's project, right now, you need to go to the project, you need to copy the URL, and then you can clone that project and go back to the terminal and do that. And if you know the project name, you can actually now do that just in one line. GH brings just the entire concept of issues to the command line. So issues don't exist at all in Git, so that now you can create issues, list issues, view issues all right from where you already are. And lastly, when you're creating a project, right now it's pretty annoying because you have to create it locally in your terminal, and then you have to go to the website, connect the two things, and now again, you can just do that in one line. So I think the biggest thing that I learned is that designing for the command line is really the same as designing for anything else. So we have those design constraints I talked about. And just to give you a sense of what it's like to use these design constraints, so that say this is some raw output, this is what it's like to add space. This is what it's like to make some things bold. So you can already see there's some hierarchy building up, adding color, and adding some icons. So I think you can really see how just using a light touch with these variables, you can make output so much easier to look at and easier to understand. So people also, that said, so people also just customize all of these things. So people customize their colors, their fonts, they can make aliases, so they can just completely rename the commands that you made for them. So that same command I just showed you, this is what it might look like in someone else's terminal. The concept of home. So any product is going to have the concept, like some kind of landing experience. So this is ours. So this is what we call a help page. And this is how we give people a jumping off point to explore the rest of the tool and read about it and understand what it does. So we make sure that this is really concise and easy to understand so that people can, from the get-go, just learn and explore on their own. We think about accessibility. We worked with some consultants who work with GitHub, and one of my favorite things we learned from them is that when someone is using VoiceOver and reading this, a bunch of spaces don't actually read as a pause. So right now, this line would read as issue create and view issues, which doesn't make sense as a sentence. It's really hard to understand. So we add colons, and colons more reliably read as a pause. So this now will read as issue, create and view issues. And so now that's a lot easier to understand as a sentence. We think about discoverability. So discoverability is probably the toughest thing to deal with on the command line, but I think the way we get around that is having a really clear and consistent language system. Designing this early really allowed us to find holes in our own system. So for example, like we decided to not use the word open because open could be misconstrued as open an issue or open in the browser. So we decided to just not use that and stuck with using create or view instead. And I think the most important part of this is that it helps people memorize and it helps people predict how things work across the whole tool. And all of this also exists on our docs site, so you can peruse that at your own leisure. Apologies if you can hear any noise in the background. I have a parrot who's screaming. So anyway, I designed also a way for people to go from the website down locally. So these are ways for people to introduce themselves to the tool, and also it's ways for us to teach you a little bit about how the tool works. We try to encourage good behavior. So this is something I actually worry about a lot in our tool. So if you strip away all of the context from GitHub, like the avatars and people's names, and we also make it easy for people to move faster and script things, how can we still encourage people to, behave well on our platform? A small way we do that is by adding issue templates to any creation flow. So these are really important for project maintainers because it helps people write good issues. So we make sure to include that step from the command line as well. And I think just overall making things simpler and easier just helps people follow best practices a little better. So that principle of no news is good news that I mentioned at the beginning, this is actually a rule that we decided to bend or even break because we are, working on modern computers with modern keyboards. So we thought that that was a good reason for us to be able to be a little more verbose than most command line tools. So we do actually show success messages. So there's no experience where you hit it and then just nothing happens and it's weird and you don't know what happened. So we do show a success message, lets you know that the thing that you wanted to do did happen and you're in this new state. We also show some context setting headers. So before we added these, people would do things like create pull requests in the wrong repository, or they wouldn't really know what list they were looking at. So I think these headers really just help you know where you are and know what you're doing. And it's a really helpful way for you to just think a little less, understand what's going on, and make you feel a little more secure in what it is you're doing. And for riskier actions that are difficult to undo, we make sure to include a confirmation step. So I think all of these things together just contribute to a sense of comfort and a sense that we're looking out for you. So preferences, we don't necessarily have like a settings cog in the corner. But we do have a config file where you can set preferences like your preferred editor. We think about consistency. So I think a lot of what we do is just make this tool feel familiar with what you already know on github.com. So if you're familiar with GitHub, you know that these colors really hold a lot of meaning. So open is always green, closed means red, merged means purple, and we make sure to reflect all of those locally as well. Same here. So for a pull request, you're always looking for have my checks passed, has my code review passed, and we also reflect that state as closely as we can as well. in general, just a list of closed issues will still look and feel like a list of closed issues. And we reflect flows as well that people are familiar with. So if you merge a pull request, you select the method, confirm it, and then you can delete the branch. And this is how we reflect that flow in the tool. So you select the method, you can delete the branch, not just on GitHub now, but also locally, and you see those messages and their respective colors that you're familiar with. We also ask for feedback. So in that help page I showed you earlier, we have a few ways that we ask you to let us know what you're thinking. And so we have this feedback form that we've gotten a ton of really awesome, really helpful feedback from. And we also prompt you to open an issue in our repository using the tool itself, which makes me smile. This is just an example of my favorite feedback that we've ever gotten. This just makes me laugh, and I put it in every presentation. We think about surprise and delight. We have had some really fun hack days, and one of my favorite projects that came out of that was this hack day project by Nate Smith, and he made this project called Repo Garden, and this actually generates a garden from the commits in your repository. So I just think this is absolutely beautiful. So it's kind of like a text adventure where you're walking around this garden and exploring the commits in your project. Lastly, this tool is all open source. So this is an example of me doing design review with a contributor recently. And yeah, lastly, just designing for a text-only interface really forced us to be creative under all of these constraints that I talked about today. And I'll leave you with this. What would the text-only version be of whatever it is you're designing? I hope it'll help you learn something new, or it'll help you see the problem with new eyes, because it definitely did that for me. And as a final treat, this is a command called GH credits, another hack day project by Nate. And this is just a big thank you to all of the people who have contributed to our project today. So thank you, everybody.